Hello, this is Ken Johnson at the University of North New Hampshire. I'm a senior demographer at the Carsey School of Public Policy and a professor of sociology, and I'm here with my colleague Dante Scala from the Political Science Department to talk about our latest research on the 2020 presidential election.
Good morning.
Sorry. Sorry. So we're talking today about our analysis of the Biden victory and how that came to be along the entire rural-urban continuum. One of our concerns in our research is that sometimes the rural-urban continuum is really dichotomized into rural America and urban America. And one of the points we want to make very clearly here is that there's more to the continuum from rural to urban than just a dichotomy. And I think that'll become clear in our research. So this is our new brief that has been released yesterday by the Carsey School. It's available on the Carsey website for free. Anybody who wants it can certainly download it. And I want to talk a little bit about the data that we used and the methods that we used. So we're using counties here as our unit of analysis. There are 3,140 counties in the United States. And we're looking at the 2008 to 2020 presidential election. I want to emphasize that the 2020 data is still preliminary. There are still about 100 counties that have not been counted and haven't reported their results. And there'll probably be adjustments into the voting data from other counties as well. So you can think of these as fairly accurate, but still preliminary. Now, we're going to show you different kinds of counties. We're going to divide the United States up into groupings of counties. Two major groupings are metropolitan counties, which have an urban center of about at least 50,000 in them. And then there may be other counties connected to the metropolitan area that are suburban. And the rest of the counties are non-metropolitan. That is, they're outside these metropolitan areas. So these are our two main groups of counties. There are 1,163 metropolitan counties and about 1,949 non-metropolitan counties. To develop our rural-urban continuum, we're going to subdivide those counties into 8 groups. On the metropolitan side, we're going to group together the counties that are the cores of metropolitan areas of 1 million or more. So these are the counties that have the cities in them. For example, Chicago would be the core of the Chicago metropolitan area, and Cook County would be included as that urban core county. We also are including the suburbs of those large metropolitan areas. And then we're also, the rest of the metropolitan areas we're classifying as small metropolitan areas. Those are metropolitan areas of less than 1 million. And then the suburban counties that surround them as well. On the rural side, or non-metropolitan, and we're going to use those terms metropolitan, non-metropolitan, and urban and rural interchangeably. We have adjacent counties, that is, counties that are near a metropolitan area and have a town of at least 10,000, between 10 and 50,000 in them. Counties which are also adjacent to metropolitan areas but don't have a town of at least 10,000 in them. And then further removed from the urban areas are the non-adjacent counties, again, those with towns of 10 to 50,000 in them and those without. And you can see the number of counties in each of those groups. This is a map to show you these different groupings that we're going to be using. So the oranges and reds are the big metropolitan areas of 1 million or more and their suburbs. The two blues are the smaller metropolitan areas and their suburban counties. And then the greens are the adjacent counties that are next to a metropolitan area. And the gray counties are the non-adjacent counties. Now, if you think about the population of the United States, we have about 282 million people living in metropolitan areas, and you can see how they're split fairly evenly between the big core counties of metropolitan areas, their suburban counties, and then the smaller metro cores. That represents almost 80% of the U.S. population. And then the small metropolitan suburbs are also part of that group. And then you can see the rural counties represent, although they represent the majority of all U.S. counties, they only represent 46 million people. On the right-hand graphic is the voting as far as we know it right now in the 2020 election. And you can see the breakdown is similar in that the metropolitan areas have about 85, a little over 85% of the vote, and the non-metropolitan areas have about 14% of the vote. Now, one important point, and Dante will talk about this a little bit more, is that 150 million people voted in the 2020 election compared to 128 in 2016. So on top of these differences in distribution, we also have a significant number of additional people voting in the 2020 election. Dante?
Thanks, Ken. So here is a map of, so far, as you can see, not all the map is quite filled in yet because we're still awaiting voting results. But you can see the percent voting for Joe Biden in 2020. The red areas are where Biden received less of the vote, often less than 30% of the vote. And the blue areas where Biden received more than 50% of the vote. And this map shows, you can look in places like Pennsylvania, Georgia, Florida. If you look up and down the eastern seaboard, you see that kind of familiar pattern where in Pennsylvania, for example, much of Pennsylvania is red. Many rural counties supported Donald Trump very strongly, just as they did in 2016, although a little bit less, as we'll talk about in another slide. But the urban areas, including the Philadelphia and its suburbs, for example, like Montgomery County, turned out to be quite blue. And you can see it even more starkly down in Georgia, where you see a mostly red state, but with a small cluster of urban counties, suburban counties in the northwest part of the state. And that turned out to provide the margin of victory for Biden in 2020. And here is a look at the vote so far for the Democrats for Joe Biden by region. We have going back to 2012 versus 2020. And what's striking to me, Ken, is looking at the regions and comparing 2012 to 2020. And you can see some kind of interesting regional differences. Now, certainly across the board, Biden did better than Hillary Clinton in every region of the nation. But comparing Biden, say, to Obama in 2012, you see a couple of interesting differences. For example, Joe Biden did a bit better in the South in 2020 than Obama did back in 2012, but worse in the Midwest. He did far better, well, a few percentage points better in the West than Obama did in 2012, but slipped a couple of points in the Northeast. So even though Biden was able to put together a majority of the vote, it differs in some respects than the coalition that Obama was able to put together back in 2012. And here is Biden's vote separated along the rural-urban continuum that Ken and I have been talking about in our latest research. And 2008, which was Obama's first election to the presidency, is in the yellow. Then gray was his re-election bid in 2012. The red column was Hillary Clinton's bid for the presidency in 2016, what percentage of the vote she got. And then 2020 is Joe Biden. Notice if you go from left to right, you see the metropolitan large core, very little difference there. Very consistent, strong support for the Democratic candidate going back to 2008. A bit of slippage in 12 and 16, and then Biden basically matches 2008 figures. You go to the large suburbs, notice more of a steep decline from Obama's performance in 2008 down to Hillary Clinton's performance in 16. Biden won a lot of that back in 2020. Small core, that's the small metropolitan cores that Ken talked about earlier. We see a similar pattern where lots of slippage from 2008 to 2016, Biden winning a significant portion of that back, but far from all of it compared to say 2008. And then we hit that inflection point from the small core to the small suburbs, and notice the very steep drop off from 2008 down to, from the yellow column to the red column from 2008 to 2016, where Hillary Clinton performed very poorly in 16. And Biden won some of that vote back in 2020, but not a lot of it, especially when you compare the blue column to the yellow column. And then when we switch over to the non-metropolitan groupings, you notice a similar pattern to the small suburbs. And that's one of our key findings in our recent research, is that those small suburbs compared to the large suburbs close to major metro areas, the small suburbs are a different thing altogether. And the small suburbs often behave politically like rural America. And so we see that pattern, again, we look from left to right across the non-metropolitan. We see Obama do fairly well in non-metropolitan, but then a steep drop off in 2016. And what we see is that Joe Biden clawed back a little bit of that rural non-metropolitan vote, but not a lot of it. And that's true in all the rural groupings. We see that, in no case does Joe Biden come even close to Obama's 2012 performance, let alone his 2008 performance. So one thing that shouldn't be lost in Donald Trump's loss of this election is how strongly Trump's base performed, not just once, but twice, especially out in rural America. I mean, that vote seems to be cementing, if one can say that, in the Republican column. And what will be interesting, of course, is if the Republican Party is moving to a post-Trump era. And of course, we don't know the answer to that. And we might not know that for some time, because we don't know if, for instance, if Donald Trump or perhaps one of his children will run for national political office. We see that rural vote, really lining up in the Republican column, which, as Ken pointed out, is not a huge vote, but it is important in those swing states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. It certainly helps to keep the Republicans competitive there.
Dante, one thing we also noticed that about this graphic is that the vote in rural America, although it is consistent across time within each grouping, there are differences between the groupings. For example, the Democrats usually do better in rural areas where there's a bigger place, where there's a town or a small city, and they consistently do less well, both in adjacent and non-adjacent areas, in counties that don't have any town in them. So there are variations even within the non-metropolitan areas. They're not all exactly the same, which is another important point we make in our research.
Now, here is a look at non-metropolitan areas, and here they're divided up by the economy that dominates that particular county. In other words, what is the central aspect of the economy that supports lots of people in these counties? And we have in the left-hand column, recreation, retirement. So those are examples. Retirement is where, of course, people go to retire, and recreation, places where the economy is built around amenities, tourism, things like that, versus more traditional rural counties, farming, mining, manufacturing. And so one thing that's striking is how different recreation rural counties vote from the rest of rural America. And that's the top row. And we see both in, the left hand is 2020, the right hand is 2016. In both those instances, recreational counties were far more likely to vote Democratic than other types of rural counties. And we see also that Biden improved performance the best in 2020 relative to 2016 in those recreational counties. And then we see, in second place are those counties that are built around people working for the government. Biden did, again, relatively well there, not great in absolute terms because he didn't even get 4 out of 10 votes, but better than the rest. And then we see rural retirement counties where Biden improved a bit over 2016, but again, he only gets about 1 out of 3 votes. But then notice what happens in those more traditional rural counties, farming and mining, really hardly any change from 2016 to 2020. So to sum up, we heard a lot of political commentary over the last week, which is very familiar to us now, comparing blue urban America to red rural America. What we want, we don't deny that that's certainly important, but we want to point out that it's wrong to simply summarize rural as red rural without thinking more seriously about the nuances and variations in rural America as well as urban America. The suburbs are a good case in point. Oftentimes you'll hear commentary saying, well, the suburbs moved in a Democratic direction. And that's true, especially of the suburbs of major metro areas, but not so true for those suburbs in smaller metro areas. Biden won the election by doing a little bit better on the margins in a lot of places. What you saw was that his Democratic support increased across the entire continuum. And as our colleagues over at the Daily Yonder pointed out in an article this week, part of that was due to the fall off in third-party support between 2016 and 2020. Third-party candidates received relatively little of the vote compared to 4 years ago. And so to sum up, right there, as I said, Biden did a little better, modestly better in a lot of different places along the continuum. And in a close election like that, all of those small changes added up.
So thank you very much. If you have any questions, we'd be happy to answer them.
Hi, Ken. This is Laurel. We have a few questions. The first is, how big an impact has demographic change had in the electorate between 2016 and 2020?
Well, that's a good question for a demographer like me. So I would say that it had a modest amount of change. The population of the United States really hasn't grown very much between 2016 and 2020. Between the downturn in fertility and difficulties with immigration, the population has remained relatively slow growing. Rural America actually hasn't grown at all between 2016 and 2018. So it's not as if the population has grown very dramatically in that area. Now, there is migration moving around in the United States, domestic migration, and that has an effect. For example, it may be affecting the recreational counties. It may be affecting the suburban counties. The other thing about demography to remember, and this is often forgotten, is that between 2016 and 2018, probably 8 or 9 million people of voting age died, and about 12 or 14 million young people became old enough to vote. So that's a change of roughly 20 million in the number of voters, or the actual voters who voted. And given that some of the data seems to suggest that younger voters are more likely to be voting Democratic, and that it's older voters who are more likely to be Republican, these kinds of demographic changes could have some influence on the electorate. But of course, the other big difference is how much more turnout there was between 2016 and 2018. I'm sorry, 2016, 2020.
Thank you. Okay. How will demographic change influence future elections?
Yeah, that's the big question everybody's wondering about. In the short run, again, I don't think the U.S. population is going to grow very much, with the COVID deaths this year probably being 300,000 by the end of the year. We're probably going to have the slowest growth rate in the American population, maybe in history. We also haven't had much fertility. I mean, birth rates are down quite dramatically. So, in terms of the growth of the American population as a whole, it's not growing very much right now. Now, what is happening to the American population is that it's becoming more diverse. Most of the growth, almost all of the growth in the U.S. population, is because of uh, minority populations. The white non-Hispanic population actually isn't growing anymore. So over the course of the next few years, the diversity of the American population will change. And a lot of the attention that's being given to the issue of how diverse populations are voting is directed toward that issue, that we are seeing this demographic change coming down the line.
And one of the things that we're going to be spending time unpacking over the next several months, we political scientists and demographers too, is the question of especially the Latino vote, and whether how much better did Donald Trump do among those voters. The most outstanding example that we saw was in Miami-Dade County, where apparently Cuban Americans were quite supportive of President Trump. Now, of course, Hispanics are a very diverse community. And on the other end of the country, we saw, for example, Joe Biden make a breakthrough apparently in Arizona and carry that state. Hispanics there, Mexican American origin, mostly. And so you see a very diverse community, but it'll be interesting to look in places like Texas, Ken, and other, to see whether, in fact, racial polarization is still kind of keeping pace with partisan polarization, or whether perhaps an unexpected byproduct of the Trump years is that we've become maybe a little less racially polarized. And one of the questions I wonder about going forward for the Republican Party, of course, is how they're going to cope in particular with an increasingly diverse United States, because we saw after 2012, for example, Republicans do an autopsy on what had happened in 2012 and make a lot of recommendations, including making the party more friendly toward immigration, for example. And the Republican rank and file responded by nominating Donald Trump to be the president. So it'll be interesting looking forward in 2024, how the Republicans in particular will manage the question of an increasingly diverse country, but also that, certainly that is the case for Democrats as well. I don't think they can take for granted that they're necessarily going to stay the quote unquote party of diversity. I think it's something that they're going to have to keep working at as well.
Yeah, it's a good point, Dante. And the other thing I would say, and you mentioned this as well, is there's one thing about talking about the overall demographic trends in the United States is because of the electoral college system, it matters very much where those minority populations are growing. And one of the things we've seen in other research we've done is that the Hispanic population in particular is spreading out across the United States. It's not all just staying in large urban areas anymore. It's becoming a significant part of the labor force in many rural areas where there aren't enough young adults anymore to do all the jobs in dairy farming and picking vegetables and things like that. So it's not just the overall trends. As you pointed out, it depends on what's happening in a given state and how that might impact the patterns in that individual state, given the way we vote in this country.
Okay, we have one last question. What are the differences between Biden's winning coalition of voters and the coalition that Obama put together in 2012?
I think one key thing to look at is, as I mentioned earlier, certainly large urban cores were central to both the Obama coalition and the Biden coalition. So no big differences there. I do think that you look at the suburbs and Biden's performance in the suburbs, here, in various swing states, I think is a key figure. And, one thing about looking at college educated voters in particular, there's a town here in New Hampshire called Bedford. And typically it's very Republican area, an area that votes, 10 points more Republican than the rest of the country, let's say. But in this election, Biden carried the town of Bedford. And so you saw that happening where these very kind of large, coarse, prosperous suburbs were moving in a decisive way for Biden. And one thing that'll be worth tracking going forward is, was that just a reaction to Donald Trump, or was that a reaction to the Republican Party that might be more of a long-lasting thing, I think is something to keep in mind.
Okay, Laurel, if we don't have any more questions, I think we can thank everyone for coming. And we can also remind you that the brief is available for download, as are a couple of other briefs that Dante and I have done recently about the congressional elections and the 2016 back to 2000 election. They're all available on the Carsey website, and people are certainly invited to download them. Thank you.
Thank you.